Senator MItch McConnell is the senior U.S. Senator from the great state of Kentucky. He is a member of the Republican Party and is the minority leader of the Senate, for those of you who don't know that. He began his senatorial career when he ran for Senate in 1984. That is when he narrowly defeated incumbent Walter D. Huddleston by 5,200 votes. That sounds like a lot, but with the amount of folks voting that year, that was 0.4%. So he came in narrowly, but has served us for many years since. He graduated with honors from the University of Louisville. That's okay, I'm a UK graduate, so I was glad to know also that he is a graduate of the University of Kentucky College of Law. He has been busy in Washington. As you know, a lot is going on in Washington right now. Politics are very fiery in our country, so to speak, and we certainly appreciate him taking time out of his extremely busy schedule to join us today. I know that we are one of 6 events that he is scheduled to speak at today. So that gives you an idea of what kind of schedule the senator keeps. So, without much ado, I would like to introduce Senator MItch McConnell. Also, one more tip before you come up. He is the longest serving U.S. Senator in Kentucky history. So that is a feather in his cap for the service that he's done for us. Senator McConnell, please. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much, Amy. Can everybody hear me? Okay. It's good to be back in Jessamine County, and I want to say at the outset, you all know which side of the political aisle I'm on, and I'm going to give you my point of view about where the country is these days and where I think we need to go to fix it. Some of you may consider this rather political, but on the other hand, you can invite somebody else to give you the other point of view, which I recommend you do. You know, we learned in pretty early on in school that the people that get the most votes make policy. The winners make policy and the losers go home. And we had an experience, my side had an experience with that in 2006 and 2008. We had 2 very bad elections in a row. And the American people in January of 2009 had a brand new president with a 65% approval rating. His party had a 40-seat majority in the House, which is really big. And even more important, they had 60 votes in the Senate. The U.S. Senate's an unusual body. It's the only legislative body in the world where a majority is not enough to do everything. A lot of things we do in the Senate require a supermajority of 60 votes. The president's chief of staff at the time, now the mayor of Chicago, famously said, "A crisis is a terrible thing to waste." What did he mean? Well, the crisis he was referring to, of course, was the economic situation, and the president did inherit a difficult economic situation, but that's not what he was talking about. What he really meant was they had the votes and they were going to do what they wanted to. All the kind of liberal to-do list that had been made up over the years that was thwarted because inconveniently one party had control of part of the government. All those obstacles were removed and they did whatever they wanted to. We saw the $1 trillion stimulus, the takeover of American health care, the nationalization of the student loan business. We now have a debt the size of our economy, which makes us look a lot like Greece. We've had 4 straight years of annual deficits of $1 trillion. We now have a $16 trillion debt. That's the size of our economy, and that's what makes us look a lot like Greece. Now, all of that was passed. You've heard this talk about obstructionism and people getting in the way and all of that, and why can't everybody get along? Remember, you didn't hear any of that the first 2 years. I'd love to have been able to obstruct this stuff, but I didn't have the votes to. And so it all passed. And in November of 2010, the American people issued what one pundit in Washington called a national restraining order. Stop it. They took a look at all this and decided they didn't like it. So they flipped the House of Representatives, made me the leader of a much more robust minority in the Senate. The numbers now in the Senate are 53 to 47. And it was clear that American people didn't want us to do any more of what we'd done the first 2 years. All of those policies are in place. We've had 41 straight months of unemployment above 8%. I think we can stipulate that if government borrowing and spending and over-regulating and threatening to raise taxes would create an economic boom, we'd be in the middle of it. You couldn't do any more than they did the first 2 years to explode the size of government and government activity. 150,000 new bureaucrats were hired in Washington. They're crawling all over every business in America. We've seen specifically what the EPA has done to the coal industry. We've got a virtual depression in eastern Kentucky, but it's not just coal. It's everywhere. They're crawling all over every business with the notion that if you're making a profit, you must be up to no good. You're obviously cheating your customers or mistreating your employees or both, and they're here to help you. My favorite anecdote, I ran into a guy out in another state within the last month, and he said he's the CEO of a medium-sized business, and he said we'd never really had much experience with regulators. We just sort of doing our own business and doing well and hiring people and growing, and all of a sudden this regulator from the federal government showed up with his checklist, and he said, I decided to handle it myself. He said, I spent the whole day with him, and we cleared every hurdle, and at the end of the day, I felt compelled to ask him, why are you here? He said, well, sir, the honest answer is you're making too much money. That's the attitude of this administration. And you see it in everything they do, the complete bias against the private sector. Now, what has all this produced? All of this stuff that they did. They are incredibly, by the way, I'm not watching any of the Democratic convention. I've heard all this before. And besides, it interferes with my baseball games. But for those of you who are watching, I know what they're saying. It's really not their fault, you know, not their fault. I've heard the president blame the tsunami in Japan, the debt crisis in Europe, rich people, Wall Street, of course, Republicans in Congress, George Bush, and by the way, Mitt Romney is Gordon Gekko. The old Wall Street movie in the 80s, if you didn't see it, you ought to get Netflix to send it to you. Michael Douglas played Gordon Gekko, who was famous for saying greed is good. So that's their campaign. It's not their fault. Everybody else kind of got in the way. Really could have or should have been better, but all of these other people prevented me from doing what I needed to do. Well, what you can't repeal, they're now incredibly also arguing that we really are better off now than we were 4 years ago. Now that does take a suspension of credibility to make an argument like that. Let me just give you some facts. Unemployment, in the time the president's been in office, up 5.1%. Worker health insurance costs up 23%. Gas prices up 89%. College tuition up 25%. Middle class income down $4,600. Federal debt, as I've already mentioned, up 50% in just 3.5 years. Food stamp recipients up 45%. Home values down 12%. Now, by any objective standard, things are not better now than they were 4 years ago. I want to be fair about this. Now, the president did not inherit a cheerful situation. It was a difficult time. But let's compare this difficult time to other difficult times. I've looked at the recessions we've had in our history in this country. Typically, the deeper the recession, the bigger and steeper the bounce back, until this one. This is the most tepid recovery, if it is a recovery, in American history after a deep recession. So you got to ask yourself, why this puny bounce back, if you can call it a bounce back? Why, it's the government itself. The government itself. The president had a choice 2 years in. You know, they had President Clinton up last night. I'm sure I'm sure old Bubba was doing as well as he could, given the facts. But you know, President Clinton had a similar experience. 2 years into his term, he got thumped with the '94 midterm election, which flipped the House of Representatives for the first time in 40 years, and the Senate as well. President Clinton took a look at that and he said to himself, you know, maybe I'm not going to get to be the next FDR. Remember, every Democrat wants to be the next FDR. Clinton tried that in the first 2 years, and when the public reacted negatively to it, he pivoted to the center, the political center. And actually, with a significant amount of urging from a different kind of Congress, did some important things. Welfare reform, for example. We actually balanced the budget in the late 90s for multiple years. That may not have been initially on President Clinton's to-do list, but the man recognized the public was in a different place from him. So President Obama, as he described it himself, gets a shellacking 2 years into his first term and has the same series of choices, but makes a different decision. I was momentarily optimistic because I got a call from the vice president shortly after the 2010 election. And he said the president would like for us to see if we can negotiate an extension of the current tax rates for 2 years. Sounds good to me, I said. So we had what I would consider a fruitful and balanced negotiation. I got what I wanted, in addition to the 2-year extension of the current tax rates, in other words, not raising anybody's taxes, which was a much better death tax rate than was going to happen 2 years ago. It was going to go, the rate was going to go to 55%, and the exemption was going to go down to $1 million. I got a $5 million exemption and a 35% rate for 2 years. They got a 1-year extension of unemployment insurance, which was important to them. That was a pretty good trade. I ended up at the signing ceremony. It was almost an out-of-body experience. Won't surprise you to know that Reid and Pelosi were not there. That's my definition of a good deal. By the way, on the estate tax for a minute, you know you can use that $5 million exemption now. You don't have to die to use it. You can't use it twice. But I don't know what the rate will be after the end of this year. And if you're lucky enough to have a family farm or a small business that your children are interested in and you've been concerned about in terms of estate planning, how in the world you're going to keep it in the family, the $5 million exemption, which would be very helpful to a lot of family farms and small businesses in Kentucky, is available now. I don't know what it'll be after the end of this year, and I know a lot of people across our state have been using this. So to go back to my point, I thought, well, maybe we're going to be able to do some business here after the extension of the tax rates. Well, regretfully, that proved to be an aberration and not the beginning of a trend. And shortly thereafter, the president doubled down on the left and has been largely unavailable to do anything in the center since then. Not that the Speaker and I have not tried. If you recall, we told the president if he wanted to raise the debt ceiling, we needed to do something about the debt. Now, the way they had handled raising the debt ceiling in the past is sort of like passing a motherhood resolution. In fact, the previous debt ceiling increase was dropped into Obamacare, and nobody even got to vote on it. They viewed it as just the way you do business. The government spends whatever it wants to, and we raise the debt ceiling so we can borrow the money to pay for it. So the Speaker and I said, we need to have a serious conversation about doing something about the debt here in conjunction with your request of us to raise the debt ceiling. You probably already know this, but when you think of deficit and debt, think of it in two categories. You got the short-term problem, and you got the long-term problem. The long-term problem is what will sink this country and turn us into Greece. for sure. And you can't get that problem fixed without having an adult conversation about some very, very important programs. Think of it this way. Of what we spend every year, which is way the heck too much, we only vote on 40% of it. That's what's called the discretionary budget. Very important things like defense, education, environmental protection, and the like. 60% of what goes out the door every year is interest on the national debt and very popular entitlement programs. And the reason we use the word entitlement is you get it if you're eligible, whether we have the money to pay for it or not. And there are things that we depend on and like: Medicare, Social Security, Medicaid. Senator Buford and I were just talking about. Important programs, but what's happened over the years? Today, these programs don't fit the demographics of our country. America has changed dramatically, in part due to the incredible healthcare system that we have now, not the one the president's trying to construct, but the one that we have now. When Social Security passed in the 30s, the average American lived to be 61. When Medicare was passed in the 60s, it was set at 65. Today, the average male lives to be 79, the average female lives to be 81. That's average, so imagine how many people are living a lot longer than that. Now, don't misunderstand me. I don't want to live a day less than the good Lord had in mind for me. But the question is, since this money is money in and money out, everybody thinks there's a trust fund somewhere. There's not any trust fund anywhere. Money in, money out. You have to make the programs fit the demographics of the country, or you can't afford them. Thinking of it another way, one former colleague of mine used to put it this way. He said, in every society you have people in the wagon and people pulling the wagon. If you put too many people in the wagon, pretty soon the wagon won't move. That's Western Europe. It's not just Greece, it's Italy, Spain, France. They've all put so many people in the wagon that they can't move it. So, what to do? Well, I think the answer is quite understandable. The doing it requires an adult conversation with the American people and a willingness to lead rather than hide under your desk. Hiding under your desk is something the current occupant of the White House is quite good at. You need to say to the American people, if you're 55 or older, you can tune this conversation out. This is not about you. This is about your children and your grandchildren and whether these programs are going to be there at all for them. The trustees of the Medicare and Social Security system say Medicare, this is before the raid on Medicare by Obamacare, before they took $716 billion out of it, had about 8 or 10 years to go before it was tanking. So no action is not an option here. Has to be fixed. So, you would say, I think, to the American people, if you're 55 or older, tune this out. But for people younger than that, I'll give you a model of the responsible thing to do. Ronald Reagan and Tip O'Neill, a Republican president and a Democratic Speaker of the House, raised the age for Social Security in the 1980s. It's still gradually going up. They didn't do it immediately. They kicked it in over a period of time. We need to do things like adjusting the age for Medicare. We need to do things like having serious means testing for Medicare. You know, Warren Buffett's always complaining about not paying enough in taxes. What I'm complaining about is I'm paying his Social Security. Why should we be providing these kinds of entitlement programs for billionaires and millionaires and billionaires? We can't afford it. Those are the kinds of adjustments we need to make so that these very necessary programs fit the demographics of our country. The Speaker and I tried to get the President to do that all of last year. He doubled down on the left. He didn't want to change anything. He did not make what I would call a Clintonian move to the middle. And he is staking his presidency and this election on the hopes that we have put so many people in the wagon and that's his vote, that he can win. So, ladies and gentlemen, this is the biggest race in my lifetime. I confess to having said one other time I thought it was the biggest election ever. I was wrong. This one is. Never before have we had such a clear choice before us about what does this country want to be like. We are a compassionate country, or we never would have passed Social Security and Medicare in the first place, or Medicaid. But in between providing a cushion for the elderly and a cushion for the poor, America always was, in its basic soul, an opportunity society. And of course, opportunity and security are always competing with each other. If you have too much security, you won't have any opportunity. I remember sitting in Delhi in India a few years ago at a dinner with an economist, an Indian economist. And she said, Senator, you know the thing that's wrong with our country? I said, no, what is that? She said, well, you can't fail here. You can't go out of business. The government won't let you go out of business. She said, if you could just have failure in our society, our GDP would go up a third. And her point was this: if you're going to have an opportunity society, you have an opportunity to screw up too. But of course, in our country, failure is never permanent. I'm not going to ask if any of you have hit a few speed bumps along the way, but it's always just been an inherent American view that if it didn't work out this time, I'm going to brush myself off and I'm going to go out and I'm going to do it again. It's going to work the next time, and it frequently does. And we have no better example of the entrepreneurial spirit than Rick Corman, you know. And I can tell you this, he built this business, didn't he? That's my point. We want to have an opportunity society, because if you don't have an opportunity society, pretty soon there won't be any opportunity for anybody. And if the security society gets too big, there's not enough money to pay for it, which is what happened in Greece. You know? Margaret Thatcher put it in an interesting way. She said the problem with socialism is pretty soon you run out of other people's money. You know, you can borrow and you can print, but sooner or later that doesn't work. So the balance sheet of your country right now is terrible. And it has every prospect of getting worse unless we move back in a different direction. Now, I've talked to you about the long-term debt. Let me talk about the short-term debt, the current problem. You can't get out of this trough with government spending. There's only one thing that will produce more revenue for the government, and that's a vibrant economy. And you're not going to have a vibrant economy as long as you're crawling all over every business with regulators, threatening to raise taxes, and demonizing success. Earned success in America is under attack. If you've done well, they assume you're up to no good. We need to go in a different direction. If we have a new president, my advice to him on day one would be to have a one-year moratorium on all new regulations, period. Go back and review all the regulations that have been spewing out the door over the last few years with some kind of reasonable cost-benefit ratio in mind. Number two, don't raise anybody's taxes. You've heard this tax argument back and forth, and I know some of you are probably racked with guilt that you're not paying enough in taxes. Let me just give you a few facts. This argument about people making $250,000 a year and over, that people designation includes about 1 million of our most successful small businesses that don't pay taxes as corporations, they pay taxes as individuals. They're either S corps, or I believe I saw LLC on R.J. Corman. They're either S corps or LLCs. They pay taxes just like individuals do. So when you raise taxes on, quote, people, end quote, above 250, you hit 1 million of our most successful small businesses, representing 53% of small business income and 25% of the workforce. In the middle of this economic situation, it takes me back to the deal Biden and I made 2 years ago. The president made a speech in signing that tax extension that I could have made. He said it was a bad idea to do it with an economy like we had then. We got a slower growth rate today than we had in December of 10. So this isn't about the economy. So you're probably thinking, well, maybe it's about the deficit. You know, if it doesn't do any good for the economy, maybe it does something for the deficit. This would raise enough revenue to pay for the government for 6 days. So it's not about the economy, and it's not about the deficit. It's about the election. This kind of nonsense is all we've heard all year long. And I'll close before taking your questions. The reason we hear all this nonsense is they cannot run on this record. They're not going to talk about anything they've done because nobody likes it. The whole campaign is designed to deceive us into thinking there are all these villains out there who've gotten in the way, these people who are not like you, they're anybody that you don't know, who've sort of gotten in the way and created this difficult turf. And that's why the president hadn't done any better than he is. Well, I guess he's also hoping that you're going to believe the next 4 years are going to be better. Well, let me suggest to you, all these villains that he's been pointing out, they're still going to be around. He's not going to have control of the House of Representatives. You may be looking at the next majority leader of the Senate. He's not going to have the kind of control in the Congress he had for the first 2 years. At what point here would the villain, would the finger pointing stop and the leadership begin? I don't know. I'm asked all the time, what do you think the president would be like in a second term? I don't have a clue. I can just tell you what he was like in the first term. He ducked every important issue, both current and future, that can keep this country from becoming a Western European country. And I can only conclude that he wants us to be a Western European country. They wouldn't put it quite that way. But everything they did moved us dramatically in the direction of imitating the Europeans, which is really mystifying because most people in the world are trying to get more like us, and it appears we're trying to be more like them. If you're confused, so am I. I still think this is the greatest country in the world. I believe in American exceptionalism. I don't think we ought to be going overseas and claiming everybody's just the same. We've been the leaders of this world for a reason. Because the way this country's been structured is not only right for us, but it's right for others. And the countries that have done the best job of imitating America are the most successful in the world today. Why in the world would we want to become a Western European country? It's beyond me. So, I'll close on an optimistic note. We always fix ourselves in this country. You know, we fought a revolution successfully. We fought a civil war, and that came out the way it needed to. We beat back the Nazis, won the Cold War, and I'm convinced that we haven't lost our fighting spirit and that we're going to straighten this country out. We need to clean up the mess that's been created by all the wrong policies over the last 2 or 3 years. I hope the American people will give us the opportunity to do that. Because remember, the winners make policy and the losers go home. And on the first Tuesday in November, we can figure out, after getting some instructions from the American people, which direction they want us to take. With that, let me throw it open for questions and see who'd like to lead off. Anybody interested in the election? Judy.
Senator, what can we do to help you become the Senate Majority Leader?
Judy said, what can she do to help me become the Majority Leader? Let me just give you the Senate landscape. We had, as I just said, we had a really bad year in 06. So 6 years later, there are a whole lot of Democrats up and only a few Republicans. There are 10 Republican seats at risk and 23 Democratic seats at risk. There are only 2 of the seats that my party currently holds that are in serious races. Scott Brown in Massachusetts, who's a miracle that he got elected in the first place in a state like that. And I think he's going to win, but he's in a real race. And Dean Heller in Nevada. So we've got, if you think of it in football terms, defense and offense, we're on defense in only 2 places of the 10. We're on offense in a lot of places. North Dakota, Montana, Nebraska. I used to say Missouri. I think that's on hold right now. Virginia, Ohio, Maine, incredibly enough, Wisconsin, Florida, New Mexico, and incredibly enough, Hawaii. We've got a great candidate from Hawaii, even though it's a really tough state for us. So somewhere in all of that, Judy, we have to net 4, which would give us a narrow majority. And even though, as I said earlier, the Senate requires a supermajority to do most things, there are some important things you can do with a simple majority. Number one, you can pass a budget, which the Democratic majority hadn't done in 3 years. The law says you have to pass a budget every year, not when it might be hard, not when you might have to negotiate with the House, not when you wake up with a headache. You're supposed to pass the budget every year. We will do that. If we pass the budget, you can do a follow-on piece of legislation called budget reconciliation. Even though I didn't like the Supreme Court decision on Obamacare, the Chief Justice declared the individual mandate a tax. Taxes are eligible for budget reconciliation. If I'm setting the agenda next year, instead of Harry Reid, repeal of Obamacare is job one. Job one. The single worst piece of legislation has been passed in modern times, and we would begin the process to get rid of it. So we need 4. We need a net 4 out of all of that, and you're in the odds-making business. I'd say it's 50-50, 50-50. Someone else. Yeah. Since you all are so shy, you want me to give me my take on it? Oh, go ahead.
I run a business that is very dependent on the cost of gas because we travel a lot. I wrote you and Ben Chandler earlier this year wondering why the Congress or the Senate cannot get together and put a stop to the speculators. It's not hard to believe that when I see gas go up 10 cents in a day and it takes 20 days to go back down, that there's something other than just a few people taking care of it. And the problem with this is it hurts our economy the worst where we need the most help, which is in the middle class. The price of gas doubles. We don't spend a lot. We spend $5,000 a year in gasoline. This year we're going to spend $8,000. 3 years ago we spent $2,500. Is there some reason that well, there's probably lots of reasons that we can't get across the aisle, so to speak, and get something solid done, but I think that is probably one of the worst things that is going on as far as economic indicators and the overall well-being of the middle class or the poor, where nobody in the United States is poor if you compare them with some of the other countries.
On the speculation issue, every time gas prices go up, there are all kinds of investigations of speculators. It's basically done by the state attorneys general in each state, and I don't know how active our attorney general has been on that. Speculators, some would argue, also serve a useful purpose. I'm not here to defend or condemn the speculators, but let me tell you the problem. The problem is America, North America, could be energy independent right now. North America could be energy independent right now. We aren't because the federal government is doing things like the president blocking the Keystone Pipeline, which is going to take energy from Canada down to our refineries. In addition, put 20,000 private sector people to work almost immediately. Talk about shovel ready, it's ready to go. With the advent of hydraulic fracking and horizontal drilling, we're on the way to becoming energy independent. I mean, you never think of oil and gas in places like Ohio and Pennsylvania and New York. Now they're going to be energy states. So we're awash in both oil and natural gas. If the federal government will get out of the way and let us produce, as Governor Romney has pointed out, North America could be energy independent by 2020. That's what we need to do. I'm not an expert on speculators or the marketing of gasoline. The Attorney General in every state gets into that issue every time we have a spike in gas prices, so you don't have to call anybody in Washington, you can call the Attorney General in Frankfurt. Yes, sir. Yeah, the question was, who enforces the law about the budget? Frankly, I'm perplexed that you would just completely ignore the law. I doubt if you could get a court to do it, because they're typically reluctant to arbitrate, congressional power struggles. But I think it's indefensible, and the best solution is to elect a Senate majority that will honor the law and pass the budget. I mean, I think that's the best solution at the ballot box. I don't think that kind of lawlessness is appropriate. And the Senate, I like the majority leader. I have to deal with him every day. I don't have anything against him personally, but I think the way he's run the Senate has been a disgrace. Not only are we not doing things that are really important that we're supposed to do, like passing the budget, we weren't going to do any more of what we did the first 2 years, but it's no excuse for doing nothing. Not only have we not passed the budget, we haven't passed a single appropriation bill. That's the 40% of the budget we vote on every year, not a one. We're apparently not going to pass the defense authorization bill, the defense of our country for the first time in half a century. The Senate isn't doing squat. And there's no excuse for it to not do the basic work of government, much of which is not terribly controversial. I mean, whether you are or aren't going to pass a defense authorization bill doesn't have a whole lot of political implications. And I think they've done a lot of damage to the institution and its reputation. And I read the other day that Congress had a 10% approval rating. We deserve it. And I'm certainly not in that 10%. I don't approve of this United States Senate. I think the way it's been run is a disgrace. Yes, sir.
Is that feasible to think that it can be repealed? And if so, how long do you think it'll take? I know you're not a fortune teller, but how long would that process take?
You need a president who would sign the bill. But what I'm telling you is, since the Chief Justice, the two linchpins of Obamacare are the individual insurance mandate and the Medicaid mandate. Now, 7 out of 9 Supreme Court justices said the Medicaid mandate is not a mandate, it's an option. And so Tom Buford and the governor and everybody in Frankfurt has a choice here. They don't have to accept the 400,000 additional Medicaid patients that they would get, part of which they're going to have to pay for down the road, and they're struggling to pay for the Medicaid they already have. The court basically said that's an option. On the insurance mandate, the Chief Justice, in a manner that I thought kind of twisted himself into a pretzel, decided to uphold it, calling it a tax. Said Congress did have the power to levy the tax. The good news is that taxes, as I said earlier, are eligible for budget reconciliation, which means we believe we can get rid of the tax with a simple 51 votes. Now, obviously, that's going to require a president willing to sign that. Our nominee for president repeated last week that he's ready to sign a bill to repeal Obamacare tomorrow. So I think that can be done. Now, it would leave the rest of the 2,700-page monstrosity in place, but none of the rest of it makes any sense without the two pillars of the bill. The Medicaid part, now optional, the individual insurance mandate part, now a tax. The states can decide whether they want this additional Medicaid burden. We can decide whether we want to continue the mandate. Look, let me just say about Obamacare. We all agree it'd be great if everybody had insurance. A lot better to have health insurance than not. But the question is, to cover the 30 or 40 million who are currently uninsured, about half of whom are young and healthy and think they're going to live forever, and have made a not entirely irrational decision that they're not going to spend their money that way. The other half have an affordability problem. So what Obamacare said is that everybody has to have an insurance policy. And the government will tell you what kind of insurance policy to buy, health insurance. And if you can't pay for it, we're going to pay for it for you. So the question was, how do you pay for that? How do you pay for that? So what they did, they took $716 billion out of Medicare today. I described earlier how we need to save Medicare for the long term. They took $716 billion out of Medicare today, out of hospitals, home health care, nursing homes, and the like, the providers of health care. They also levied a big tax on medical devices, stents, pumps, those things. So basically, they took funding away from part of the healthcare providers in order to provide for a subsidy for a whole new set of people. It can't possibly work, because what you're doing is you're throwing more people toward the providers and at the same time cutting their reimbursement. It can't possibly work, and it won't work. The best thing to do would be to get rid of it. If we are unable as a result of the election to get rid of it, then I think we're going to be back revisiting this, because it can't possibly work. It's not a snowball's chance in hell this is going to work. So what we've done is we put the government in charge of all of our health care in a way eerily similar to the way you do it in Europe. And let me tell you where that leads you. The National Health Service in England is the third largest employer in the world. Only the Indian Railroad Company and the People's Liberation Army in China are bigger than the National Health Service in England. Everybody's covered. Everybody's got free health care. The question is, when do they get around to you? I remember going, I only did this one time and I didn't catch anything, but I remember going fly fishing in Scotland a few years ago, and my guide was limping around, and I said, "What's the matter?" And he said, "My knee is killing me." I said, "Well, why don't you get it fixed? What do you need?" And he said, "Well, I need a knee replacement." And he said, "I'm on the waiting list." I said, "How long have you been on the waiting list?" He said, "About 6 months." And I said, "When do they tell you they're going to get around to you?" He said, "It'd be about another 6 months." Everybody's got free health care. The question is, when? And of course, that kind of rationing also means that if you have a serious illness, you may or may not be eligible because of the cost of the treatment. So what's happened in the UK is people who have money pay for it again. They get health care from a private market that has developed because a lot of people are not willing to put up with the mediocrity brought about by government-run health care. So we are pretty much in government-run health care now, because the federal government, which already has its hands full with Medicare and Medicaid, the federal government's big in health care already, can't afford the health care it's already got. We've just added a whole new set of Americans, given them a health insurance mandate, and said, we'll pay for it for you if you can't afford it. The practical effect of this is your federal government's going to be in charge of the health care of every single American, either directly through Medicare and Medicaid or indirectly by telling you what kind of insurance policy you have to buy. Federal government in charge of all of our health care? Any of you think that's going to make it better? If you do, I got a bridge in Brooklyn I want to sell you. So we need to get this thing off the books if we possibly can, and that will be up to the American people this November. We're going to take one more, if there is one. Yeah. Yeah, I thought we'd get around to the presidential election. I don't know, but let me give you what I think a lot of you already know. The presidency is going to be decided in 8 to 10 states. Just watch where they all go. That's also where all the money is being spent. The closest state to us that's one of those 8 or 10 is Ohio. And each of those states is pretty balanced politically between Republicans and Democrats. And there are a high single-digit number of independents that are going to determine who sits in the White House in each of those states. And both sides are trying to figure out exactly who those people are and how to appeal to them. And it's almost, if you live in Florida or Virginia or Ohio, you're getting all kinds of attention through every device available to reach you and try to influence your decision. I don't know how it's going to come out. I think the race has been consistently close, not only nationally, but inside those states. The arguments I've already given you, their argument is that it's not their fault. Give us 4 more years and we'll do better. Our argument is, you've been there 4 years, how'd it work out? And independent voters are hard to analyze because by their very nature, they are independent. And they are very, very significant. My side got wiped out by independent voters in 06 and 08, had really bad years. We got them back in 10, had a really good year. Independents tend to not be cable television watchers, not to be overly consumed with this stuff. Put another way, they have quite normal lives. They were busy this summer taking their kids to Little League games and the like. Sometimes they tend to be late deciders. So sometime between now and November, post-Labor Day, which we're in now, these folks are going to turn to making a decision on this. And all indications are this is going to be a really close election. I don't expect either side to blow it out, although there's one example that we're all remember that where it did blow out late, and that was the Reagan-Carter race. And we look back on it and we think, gosh, Jimmy Carter was dead meat from the beginning. He wasn't. That was a dead even race until about 10 days out. And a lot of people had a lot of doubts about Reagan then. They thought he might be too old, or he was too conservative, or too this or too that. And once they became comforted that he could handle the job, there was a huge movement in his direction. I'm not predicting that this time. I think this race is likely to be real close all the way to the end. I don't know who's going to win. I do think the stakes for the country are enormous. I think the President Obama we saw in the first term is likely to be the same one we'll see in the second term because he had ample opportunity to go in a different direction after the 2010 election and chose not to. So I don't know who's going to win, but I think the stakes are enormous. I think the two candidates have very different views of what this country ought to be like, and the American people will decide who wins. Hey, let me thank you all for the opportunity to be here and for many of you for your friendship and support over the years. Thanks a lot. See you soon.
Very much. Thanks a lot.